All right, good afternoon, everyone. So as we start, I wanted to give a thanks to Deb and to the entire team here who made Aspen Ideas Health happen. And so if you'll join me in a round of applause for them, thank you. So I'm delighted today to be moderating this panel on inclusive research in more equitable medicine. And I'll just set up the framework as the following. We talk about health equity a lot, and I'm so glad that during this entire session here at Aspen Health that there has been equity embedded in so many, really in every one of the conversations. I think sometimes though, when we talk about equity, when we talk about health equity, sometimes people are left with this feeling of, well, what should I do about it, right? This problem is so big, it's so long-standing, what is my role here? And I'm glad that there's a panel specifically addressing what is it that we can do through the lens of research, including through fair representation and research and development. And I think throughout this pandemic, we've learned so many lessons. And one of the areas that we should explore is how do we take the lessons that we've learned from innovations during COVID and apply them in a way that truly advances health equity. And so I'm glad to be joined today by three experts, Dr. Aida Habtizian, the Chief Medical Officer of Pfizer, Donna Cryer, the President and CEO of the Global Liver Institute, and Dr. Gary Puckrin, the President and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum. And so I would love to begin with all of you to give a brief introduction. Tell us about yourself and your role and how you come to this topic of health equity and inclusive research.
Thank you, Lena. I'm very excited to be here. As you mentioned, I'm a Chief Medical Officer at Pfizer and also lead worldwide medical and safety. I'm also on leave of absence from Stanford University. I'm a professor of medicine. And how I come up to this health equity, as you mentioned, is what we've learned from the COVID pandemic, what has really resurfaced, what has already been underneath it, and how do we make sure, and what are the lessons that we learned, and how could we approach it. So this is a very important aspect for us at Pfizer, and we'll talk a little bit more about the initiatives and how we are approaching it, and delighted to be here with my partners as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And Donna?
I'm Donna Cryer. I am first a patient. I have inflammatory bowel disease diagnosed more than 30 years ago, and I'm 27 years and counting post-liver transplant. And I've had the privilege of working with Pfizer at all points and sections of my career, but most fulfilling as the founder and CEO of the Global Liver Institute, which is the largest patient-led advocacy organization in the liver health field. We work across 200 stakeholder organizations in our councils and campaigns and events.
Hello, my name is Gary Puckrin. I'm president of the National Minority Quality Forum. We are a research and education organization based in Washington, D.C. My journey here is a little peculiar. My doctorate is actually in history, and I think all things history. I got here, I published a magazine for Smithsonian for about 10 years, and when I left, I wanted to start working with minority organizations who had journals and publications, but they weren't getting value because they weren't publishers. And that led me to start to work with the National Medical Association and the National Dental Association, which brought me into the world of healthcare. And one of the things I learned very, very quickly as I started to work with them is that this is in the 1990s. Healthcare did not do target marketing, did not understand populations at the zip code level. We talk about them now at the zip code level in terms of health, but in the 1990s, we didn't do that. And so there was a void of data. And so what we decided to do was to collect health data. And so we've been collecting health data now for over 20 years. We have a database of over 5 billion patient records. We collect data on about 160 million lives per year. And a lot of that data we use and partner to do work at the community level around disparities.
Wonderful, and I'm excited to hear more about the work that each of you do. But I wanted to also ask you, Aida, at the beginning of the pandemic, you were, as you were saying, a practicing physician and scientist with Stanford. Mm-hmm. So how did that inform your experience, and what has stayed with you through that experience?
Yes, I think the pandemic, hopefully I'm not echoing, I think when I go back to my transition as a physician, and I was treating patients who have a lot of immunosuppressive inflammatory diseases. So it was a time of crisis where we didn't understand about the virus, we didn't understand about the COVID-19 itself. And it was very important. What stayed with me was how it was important to stay very close to the patients, to have those webinars, whether we knew the information or not, it was really necessary to learn it together. Because this was a time, of course, we can go back right now, we are gathered here, of course, that wasn't possible, where even patients were afraid to even pick up their grocery from their doorsteps, pick up their mail, and also not understanding what it means for people who are really immunocompromised, that have other comorbidities, what that meant. So these things stayed with me and was a very important also reason why this transition for me, in terms of how do we take this science, this data, this evidence, how do we take it actually to applicable situations and solutions to really have an impact in outcomes. And so it's always been, and I think for me, the translation means a lot, like, when we talk about from bench to bedside, but also the lessons we learn from clinic, what we are seeing, the relevance, so that we could ask the right questions when we take it back to our science. And that took me to the role that I am currently, is to put really the science and patients at the center and trying to really look at the innovations and learn from the science itself, what the science is telling us and what patients are telling us, and how do we really move at the speed fast like we did with COVID, but how do we make it sustainable for all the other diseases, of course, that are in our portfolio and that are really unmet needs in our medical field.
We had a call last week in preparation for this session, and I remember something you said that really stuck with me from that, and I just would love for everyone to hear this, because it really struck a chord, and it was something about how health and equity in itself is a pandemic too.
Yes.
Help us to understand that concept.
Yeah, so for me, I feel like COVID-19, of course, we all focused because there was a common enemy. There was the virus, there was COVID-19, so we all honed in, and it was a pandemic. It's a global pandemic. But if you are a patient who's suffering of a disease that is chronic, it is your own pandemic. It is the patient's specific pandemic. So, and the other thing is the disparities that we see, particularly in the outcomes. So unless we really can deem it as a pandemic, then we would all be focused, then we would have a common goal. So I do feel that health inequity is actually the pandemic that has been chronically underlying, because we don't talk about why COVID-19, for example, why are the people who are most vulnerable are usually the ones who are those other chronic diseases, those who have disparities, those are very hard to reach, underserved population. So I do think that is a pandemic in itself. And if we do not really call it out that way, then we can't really align and focus to really solve that problem.
Well, I suspect that all of us will agree with that concept, right? That disparities existed way before COVID, but that COVID did unmask many of these issues. So thank you for highlighting that. And Donna, you've done such incredible work as a patient advocate. And I wonder if you can share with us your experience through the pandemic and how it's affected your view of the medical community, wearing your hat as a patient advocate.
I think it has changed the view, perhaps not the one I had, because I always knew of the potential of patients and patient advocates to contribute to science, to research, to care and transformations. But our partnerships with the medical community are so much stronger post-pandemic, because we were able to serve as a bridge. First, just connecting scientists from all around the world who had the best data so that it was shared faster, and who has a plan for patients with, for hepatitis or liver cancer or transplant, all of our patients are vulnerable in some way, in addition to the vulnerabilities of trying to navigate healthcare. And so seeing that this organization could be used to accelerate the pace of communications between scientists who were starting to develop protocols and best practices for their patients, and then being a bridge to the data that they needed. If perhaps in transplantation, they were getting enough to be able to say, well, this is what you should do for kidney transplants. I'm like, you need more liver patients? Let's help you with recruitment for liver patients and let them know that they are needed. For us to be able to have the information that we need to be able to guide you safely, you need to participate in this research. And so connecting them to those who were doing the highest quality research during COVID, and to increase the numbers in those registries. And so all the different ways that patient advocacy can serve as a bridge to the scientific community and to the medical society community in this very fast pace are all new pathways that we built during the pandemic.
So it sounds like a lot of things shifted for you
Yes.
as a result of the pandemic. And can you just give us some more examples too of how the Global Liver Institute, it sounds like, you really pivoted and changed your priorities accordingly.
We did, and we've more than doubled in size during the pandemic, which I think just spoke to the need to be nimble and to be clear and to move fast and to be connected. But part of our pivot was, one, we were focused a lot on building out in India, in Africa, and other places, and we still are. But our infrastructure in the United States was absolutely crumbling. We were about to lose all of community organizations in the United States. And so we created a Liver Action Network to support the ability to have community-serving organizations in the United States, and that continues today. We also working with individual patients to increase their capacity to be able to serve as peer mentors to other patients, whether that's about how to participate in research or how to sign on to your patient portal to get your vaccine. To really use a strengths-based model, an asset-based model, to mobilize individuals and communities so that I certainly recognize I'm the beneficiary of a lot of innovation. I would not be alive today without science, but there's also a lot that patients can contribute, and we really just served as a catalyst for that. And so it's exciting now to be one of the first parties invited to the table in a new initiative to resolve scientific questions as well as clinical care and quality questions.
And I would think too that having patients at the table also helps with the issue of trust.
It does.
Yes.
We were able to have a patient who graduated from our Advanced Advocacy Academy serve on the Medical Society's COVID committee. And so as they were all looking at the latest data, she was helping them in real time translate both what were the questions that we were surfacing, that patients were asking. And many patients with liver disease, with liver cancer, with transplant, with autoimmune liver diseases, our nurses, our doctors, are serving, our teachers are serving on the front lines, and they weren't going to stop. And so needing information, so channeling that information to the committee in real time, and then being able to have all the products of the committee already having that patient centricity baked in, and having the distribution network to patients and patient communities baked into the process, accelerated both trust and the spread of the accurate information.
Well, I want to turn to Gary and focus more on this issue of trust as well, because we know that there has been a lot of mistrust, distrust, especially in communities of color for the medical community or towards the medical community. How can we better bridge that disconnect?
Well, the issue of trust, there's a part of me want to say that it's pretty well founded. When you start to look at the structure and the distribution of healthcare in this country, it is obviously inequitable, and it's been inequitable for a long time. And when COVID hit, it just exacerbated the problem. One of the things that we saw, for example, we did a lot of work with federally qualified health clinics and physicians in private practice. At the beginning of the pandemic, they were faced with a lot of disinformation, not just domestic disinformation, but disinformation from abroad. And they had very little capacity to push back on it, particularly on social media. They just, if you're an FQHC, you're in the business of taking care of patients. You're not in the business of having a good fight on social media. And so, and it was not just African-American communities. I remember in the Hmong community, there was the feeling that the vaccines were there as an assassination problem, that if they got vaccinated, there was a way that they were going to get eliminated. In the Asian community, they were dealing with violence. So every community had something different going on. And so what we had to do was to network them, to bring them together, to build capacity so that they could use social media. And the way we went about it is, it was almost like a Facebook in terms of we gave each of them their own webpage, but then we did the back-end analytics to help them build audiences, because they were the trusted voices in community. They could talk to community, but they didn't have the resources to do so. And so it is possible to build that trust, but you have to use those community voices in order to do so.
What about, and back to this issue of research, I think I've heard you mention before about the role of principal investigators and how it's important to see that the researchers also represent the communities as well. So to help me understand more about that.
Yeah, so again, if we start to talk about how we distribute health information, health resources, one of the places where we have been sorely lacking is to bring diverse populations into clinical research, both as patients as well as principal investigators. I had an opportunity to do a paper with Janet Woodcock when she was commissioner at FDA, talking about training community clinicians to be PIs. Community clinicians meaning federally qualified health clinics, physicians in private practice. And so we launched a program called the Alliance for Representative Clinical Trials. And what we're doing is we're training community clinicians to be principal investigators. Again, they have the trusted voice in community. They have the patient population. They have the advantage of being in community, so you don't have to go out and travel. But they also didn't have the backbone, the framework in order to do that research. So we had to put study coordinators into their practice. We had to put technology into their practice. And also we had to then persuade sponsors of trials that they could handle the trial. And the way we did that is we supported them by partnering up with CROs to make sure that the infrastructure was in place to do the work.
I really like what you just said, because I think, again, sometimes when we talk about equity, it's such an abstract concept, and you just gave us some really concrete examples of how we can focus on this through the research context. Naida, I know this is something you think a lot about too. So tell us more about how you focus on equity and diversity too, through research and development.
Yeah, so just to tie into what Gary said is, I don't think we would be successful in terms of even, rolling out the vaccine, having the clinical trials, if we didn't have that community partnership. Like what we talk about, like in terms of, the lessons that we learned is that getting to where the patient is or the patients are. And I think these kind of relationship and partnership are really key. When I think about some of the perspectives beyond clinical trials, I think clinical trial diversity initiative is very important, right? We talk about demographics, but it's also like census, but it's very important to think about the disease demographics, right? Because every disease will impact differently different groups. So that epidemiology, that data is important. So we try to think about that when we are thinking of clinical trial diversity initiatives. And as I mentioned, also partnering with the right communities where there is actually a lot of the disparities. Another one is to think of equity or health equity end to end, which means even starting very early in early research. So it's an end where we are thinking about the clinical trial initiatives, but also starting really when we are thinking of those concepts at the bench. So we talk about how do we design drugs, how do we develop drugs, how do we think about formulations, how do we think about those biobanks, those science-driven and samples, are we really getting it from a very diverse population? So we try to think about the early, and this is one of the things that in terms of when we launched this initiatives that we are thinking at Pfizer is we're trying to think of it from really early research and taking it all the way. In a way, I think it's how do we make medicines and vaccines? Like, where does it start? Like, how do we tie it to our pipeline? Because I think if we put that equity lens across and we can follow that, just like we follow a patient's journey, we can follow those medicines and vaccines, then we would not be trying to catch up, right? So we would start early on. Of course, it will require a lot of work, heavy lifting, but I think it's something that we are very passionate and excited to really start early and then all the way to our medical activities from the R&D.
I'd also love to hear more. I know Gary had mentioned this earlier about data, but I also would love to hear from both you and Gary and Donna, if you want to add to this as well, about are the biobanks, are they diverse enough? What? Obviously not, but I would love to hear. Just trying to set up in a neutral way. But I mean, what can we? What does it look like now, and where is it that it needs to go?
Yeah, and it's exactly the point is that this is where we really need to focus. How do we need to diversify? So we're talking about clinical trial diversity initiatives. We also need to think about all our early research. The data needs to be diverse pool as well, and I think that's why we really need to get into the communities to be able to really partner so that we have access to the data, to the right data, the quality as we talked about, so that we could be used in the same manner to the data sets that we are using right now are certainly not diverse. And so this is another initiatives when we are thinking under the umbrella of equity. And we can talk about some of these if we have time, about the initiatives that we've launched to encompass, in fact, to address these specific issues.
You know, the current, biobanks, a lot of them are based off work coming out of Iceland, the most homogeneous country and community that you could think of. That's true. And so if we are to have medicines that we can trust work in people like us, there have to be people like us in the trials. Really, to date, when I look at a journal and I look at the abstract and I look at the trial data or the FDA snapshots, and okay, there's one person in this whole trial that had the same characteristics as me. So I have to sort of take it on faith that it would actually work. And so one of the things that, as we've been talking, whether on the board of the Personalized Medicine Coalition or in community outreach, is that it's so important for us to be included. It is actually our job to step forward and be partners and acknowledge the history of mistrust, but we can't have that keep us from the advances of the future. And so encouraging people from this unique admixture of populations across the United States, and then thinking about what that means globally in terms of populations and participation that will ensure that trials like Pfizer does, which are done all over the world, have participation from populations that were representative of the disease states all over the world. And what does that mean in terms of translating things, not just in language, but in culture, to create the trust and participation? So those are the things that we focus on, trying to rally patients and understand the stake that they have in contributing their genomic data to make medicines better.
Gary?
I think probably the most important thing to know about data is that healthcare is highly predictive. We can look at a zip code and tell you how many people are going to have a heart attack in that zip code, how many people are going to go on dialysis, how many people are going to have asthma. Those numbers we can know, right? And if you can know, then you can control. I mean, that's the point of the exercise. And so where we're failing at is that we're not collecting the data, particularly on diverse and underserved populations, so that we can better manage their health. And so there's no way forward when you talk about eliminating inequities or disparities without the data. This is about flying by instrument. And so my sense of it, and certainly where the National Minority Quality Forum always begins, is with the data. Tell me what the data is saying so that we can better understand. When I say understand, think about this for a second. That data is used obviously for the innovations and so get through FDA. It's then picked up for clinical guidelines to teach you how to actually treat. Then the federal government comes in and uses it for pay for performance and value assessment. So if the underlying data is not there, the clinical guidelines can't work, the performance measures can't work, the value assessments can't work, and what you end up with are the disparities that we're talking about.
Do you have, is it a challenge to recruit members of underrepresented communities into trials, or is it just that we haven't figured out the way to do it?
Now, what we haven't done is ask them, right? Every report, every survey that I've ever seen says that if you ask them, they will participate. Everyone tells you about the Tuskegee story and say, well, they're always going to bring up Tuskegee. That's not what's going on. they're not being asked. If you ask them, they will participate. Certainly, they want to make sure that you're a trusted source, that you're going to use their data purposefully, return value back to the community. But if they understand that, they will participate.
With the caveat that you have to make it easy for them to participate. So I think one of the things that I know it's exciting to be working with Pfizer with its scope and scale and the infrastructure that it's built to deliver vaccines and deliver vaccine information is how to bring trials closer to people, whether it's nurses in your homes or using telehealth to be able to do clinical research that works in the context of people's lives. So that's a real way to move the equity needle. Many people, you're right, would love to participate, but they can't take time off work or they can't take 2 buses to get to an academic site that does research. But there have been so many more online questionnaires or registries that they could participate in, mail in a sample or have it done at a local laboratory and send that in. And so if we bring research closer to people rather than having people move to the research, that is the biggest thing I feel to be able to reduce inequities.
Well, and also you do so much work on making sure that we include vulnerable individuals as well. And so can you give us some examples of maybe public-private partnerships that have been effective in this regard and why they're effective? Yeah.
Absolutely. We have worked with large laboratory companies like Lab4, for example, partnering with FAQ, Federally Qualified Health Centers, and our I think it's probably made us, in San Diego at least, the most effective CRO they've ever had because we have that trust and relationship. We pair it with education, peer mentors. We're part of the community. And so what we can build on top of that with the trust in terms of delivering health information, in terms of vaccinating for pneumonia, for flu, for hepatitis B, and be able to build real liver health centers is so exciting to be able to do. But it all starts with bringing things to people. I know that as somebody who has 8 different ologists now at this point, 27 years post-transplant and counting, it's its own separate work stream to just make the appointments, let alone to make the appointments, and to do the follow-ups and the imaging and the lab work. And so if we can make it easier for people to do that, then we won't be talking about, non-compliance. And there's a lot of inequity in the medical record, a lot of negative things said about patients that put people off participating in the medical system. And I think a lot of just putting healthcare in the flow of their lives just demonstrates just a level of partnership that will increase the amount of participation in all sports, from wellness activities to vaccination to treatment to research.
Mm-hmm. If I may add, actually, to one of the things that we are working with patient advocacy, which has been very helpful, is also this health information equity and health literacy. Because I think when we think about enrolling in trials, being at the patient, taking those trials to patients is also we should make it understandable, right? So trying, in fact, with Donna, this is in terms of with working together to make it understandable. So those of you who consented patients will know how complicated those clinical trial paperwork can be. And so how do we make this information understandable, equitable? And another one is that publishing, in fact, also in plain language summary. So our clinical trials right now, we are implementing so that all our clinical trials can have a component where we can publish it in a plain language where patients can understand.
You've also been at the forefront of returning that information to patients who have participated in your trials. That was really groundbreaking, and I know from my work with FDA and the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative that Pfizer taking that first step to return information to their trial participants, one, creates great goodwill. Everybody who participated in that trial now says, "Oh yes, participate in this trial. They respect you. They give you your information back, and then they make it clear and easy to understand." So I think that that's a really important point too about creating this ongoing and sustainable culture of participation in clinical trial research, not just sort of standing up and standing down a single trial.
Absolutely.
And Aida, you had mentioned earlier about some of the other innovations that you're piloting, and I would love to hear more about them, especially as we're talking so much about practical action.
Yes.
I think there's a lot that we could learn from what you're spearheading.
Yeah, thank you. I think the Institute, in fact, the initiative that we launched back in November last year is the Institute of Translational Equitable Medicine. For me, those T and E mean a lot. As a translational scientist, physician, as we mentioned, like this bench to bedside is like, how do we translate those science, the data, to really useful information that could have an impact into outcome. And the other one is the equity, because for Pfizer, of course, it's one of our core values, is really having that equity lens from the beginning. So this is why we're trying to launch so many, of course, we have so many pilot work that includes information equity, health literacy, but also taking it to the bench. Like really early, we talked about biobank and data is how do we make sure it's diverse? So we have some pilot studies, in fact, right now, where we are working with partnering other institutions and so on to carry those forward.
That's great. Well, I am going to be turning to the audience shortly for your questions, so be prepared for your questions. I am going to ask one more question of all of our panelists, though, and it's something I'm curious about because there's so many issues that we've raised. And if you were to highlight one thing that keeps you up at night as the most pressing issue, what might that be? Starting with Gary.
I have very many sleepless nights over a lot of issues, so trying to find one of them.
You can name multiple.
I think really, how do we get a community data lake built so that everyone has access to a common set of data? You know, we're at the cusp of we're in the middle of a medical revolution. By 2050, the diseases that we think about today should be gone. The quickest way there is through the data. But there are all of these, I call them feudal lords, sitting on top of the data that make it hard to get access to data, and it slows up progress. And so, you know, if I wake up screaming in the middle of the night, it would probably be about how do we get the data out so that everyone has access to it, that we're all speaking from the same set of information to use that. Because this is not just about disparities, this is about all of our lives. We can transform all of our lives if we have access to a common set of data.
I think that there have been so many wonderful pilots and best practices developed in reaching out to communities or in sharing data. I am concerned that they will just stop there and not be scaled and not be spread and not really be embedded into the way we do medicine moving forward or the way we do healthcare or in health and well-being moving forward. That's my greatest concern, that it'll go back, and of course trying to scale my own organization to meet those needs that we've now surfaced.
For me, Lena, as a practicing physician, I think it's the same actually what kept me at night. Previously in my practice, I always, you know, think of the patients that you have in front of you who have burned through all the standard care, and you just don't have anything. And particularly when they bring you a report and say, do you think I'll be eligible to this clinical trial or to this study? So I think being on the biopharma side right now is how do we get it quickly to the people who really need it? Because every patient lost, you know, whether it's a month, a year, we're losing many people. And so, and the same for the COVID vaccine. If we had it, you know, if people could, if that information, whatever the hesitancy, if we could get through that, whether it was distribution, getting it from vaccine to vaccination, and protecting those people that we lost, right? But also for all other medicines that are in our innovative pipeline is, will it get them on time? Will it really reach that patient? So I always go back to my clinic and to the patients that I took care of.
Yes.
And the ones that, you know, really, you know, when they felt like there was a loss of hope, what kept them hopeful was what is in the pipeline coming from me. So being on this side is really, how do we accelerate that translation is what I think about.
Well, this is why this panel was brought together, because it's quite synergistic perspectives that will keep all of us up at night. But I would love to hear questions from people, and there are a lot of questions already. In the back, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Courtney. I work on health equity in DC. A couple of questions, Dr. Pucker, and I know you and I have talked about this a lot. Data, data, data. You can't fix what you don't measure. And so for you, I would ask you and perhaps all of the panelists, what you would recommend to agencies, state and federal, to academic and research institutions to beef up, more complete data sets and information and dissemination on that. And then just another general question about Donna.
Yes.
Your comment about parachuting in and out of communities resonated. We conducted a lot of focus groups in the last couple of years, and we heard that same sort of sentiment expressed. Would like to know what you all think about the value of establishing trials within communities and putting down long-term roots would mean to inclusive research.
So on the data question, our federal government is probably one of the largest data holders in the country. And if you try to access that data, it is a mind-boggling activity. I have been doing it for 20 years, and it's the most frustrating thing you've ever imagined in your whole life, right? And the point of it is that data saves lives, right? And so I think it needs some good, strong patient advocacy here to free the data up. Now, systems have to be built, privacy has to be taken care of. They're real fundamental issues. I don't want to make light of it, that they're not big issues that have to be resolved here. But our future is in the data. The way we're going to control disease is in the data. And the longer we wait, the more lives are going to be lost, more pandemics are going to happen, and we're not really meeting our future. So I think in terms of both the federal government and then obviously the private sector, how do we bring everybody to the table in a way that makes data available so that we can get on with the business, a real business of conserving lives?
I think that's absolutely right. But during the pandemic, being both on the board of a hospital and talking to several governors who were trying to make real decisions based on the data that they realized was not only incomplete, but wasn't standardized. So they couldn't compare what was happening in their state to what was happening in another state if an intervention did or didn't work. And so I think that there is a role for standardizing how hospitals report data into their state healthcare, their state departments of health, how those states report into CDC. I think there is authority that could be given to CDC to better standardize those practices and accelerate the sharing so that on every level, city, state, regional, national level, we have more complete and standardized data available in real time to be able to work with, rather than just certain systems being able to do that. I also think that speaks to ongoing research capabilities. Patients, I think, believe that systems are learning from all of the visits and all the encounters that we have in healthcare. And so to have a point where we have to say, okay, now we're going to have a learning health system. Okay, we just have to come clean. We haven't had a learning health system to date, but we can moving forward. And so all of that data that's contributed in an EHR, as well as there's health data that you don't think of as health data in Google and geolocation and a lot of things, and combining those in unique ways with patient registries and patient-generated data. I think there needs to be an ongoing querying patient questions as well as frontline physician questions and pharmaceutical questions and research questions on these big data banks, not just thinking about research that happens for a particular new investigative medicine, but an ongoing answering of questions that people have and about combinations of medications and surgical interventions, the way real people experience healthcare, not one drug in isolation. And so I think the more that we can do that, the more that, frankly, the burden will be off of people, and the richer information we'll be able to draw.
And I'll just add to that I think your question about data and disparities or health inequities. one of the things from biopharma perspective, at least one perspective that I can, at least what we are trying to do, because I think at the end of the day, I always go back to, the point that if not us, then who? What our chairman said to our chief scientific officer when it was the vaccine, like we should. So we look back and see that, what is it that we can do? So one of the things is share, like we talked about, in fact, giving that data back. So I think hopefully when more and more, if one biopharma does it, hopefully others will join in so that we can show that how we are using this data, how useful this data is. One of the things that we did, in fact, with ITEM is to look at the diseases or therapeutic areas that we are interested in. And so how do we visualize the data? How do we, in fact, look at how can we put metrics so that we can follow, if we made a change, how do we know that we made a significant change? So one of the things we did is actually, we created a heat map of all the disease states or therapeutic areas, as we call them, that we are. What does that health disparity looks like, right? And this is something that we just published, and it became one figure, and there were 30-something, over 35 diseases that we cover. We had data from African Americans, non-white, Hispanic, Latino, but we didn't have, for example, for American Indians, for other, like Asian. But hopefully that publication will also help others to put that data out, so we can use it at the bedside. And what you see in there is the uniform disparity in outcome, especially. So I think, to your point, sometimes I look back and think about what resources do we have and how can we really contribute to this? Because it's a big question, right? All of us are in it. And so what can I do in this role? What can another individual or other group in another role? So I think I'm hopeful that if we continue to do that, maybe we can show how useful this data is and how we can use it.
I think there were a lot of other questions, but your microphone is coming.
So given that so much of this conversation today has focused on this notion that that data is a commodity, like a tradable, valuable commodity in the same way that we think about dollars or Bitcoin or something, is there any possibility that federating this data at the level of the individual and giving individual patients ownership and the ability to license out their data, would that potentially solve some of these issues of access, equity, and inclusion?
So I hope I said nothing to you that suggested that I thought that data was a commodity, right? Because I do not health data. Health data is lifeblood. We can't buy and sell that, right? We have to share that. That is the critical problem, because what's happening now is being balkanized by people who want to sell it, who want to market it. And so it makes it impossible for us to learn from it. So unfortunately, and I know Americans, we love the marketplace, and I think in this one particular space, we have to free the data. We have to be able to understand how we use that data to save our very lives. And so we can't think about it in terms of a commodity. I'm just absolutely vehemently opposed to taking health data and commercializing it like that, because it does all the wrong things that we want to do. Our health system has to be about saving lives, period, period, period.
Can I ask you all, though, just about, what about in clinical trials? I mean, there has to be a certain period of time, right, that the data are being used for specific, I mean, how do you?
I think that there are a lot of discussions in terms of individual ownership of your data. I don't think that's actually helpful, but I do think that having more patient-permissioned use of the data and a different structure for the governance of data usage for the public good would be very helpful to moving this conversation, for breaking down the type of data silos that Gary has so well articulated, so it does flow with the patient instead of it's rather balkanized, and patients stay with the health system because that's where all my data is, and it's like a walled garden. And so it's amazing, and I think we can all agree very detrimental that you can look at financial systems where you can, use your ATM card all over the world and have access to your financial information in a way that's safe and secure and, and individual to you. But your healthcare data you can't get across the street. And so we do have to solve that, but I think that is more a governance and use issue than necessarily an ownership issue. I mean, if anybody before it would be me. You can think of like the value of my individual data, over the course of this many years, this many conditions. If anybody was for it, it would be me, but I don't think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, nothing to add, yeah.
I think we have time for one last question, and so you have the final word.
Great. Hi, my name is Camille Range. I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist in public health. And so I thank you very much for all of your comments. We've talked a lot about the diversity and inclusion of the actual data, but I'm wondering if you could speak to the diversity and inclusion of the next generation of professionals after you and what you're doing in your particular roles and your particular companies to build that pipeline. Because again, we know that that data will come out more if we see more professionals and healthcare professionals who are receiving that data, if you will. And so I'd just like to hear what you've learned in your experience and what you're currently doing. And I hope
First,
that's
thanks
a good
for calling
one.
us old. So there's that.
This is for the Gen Zs and below.
So wait, my chair's still warm, so if you just give me a minute, I'm gonna let you have it. No, I mean, you make an excellent point, and it is really important, and that is where I am in my career. It has been exciting to me to build the leadership team behind me and to be able to choose to be diverse, to be intentional about the diversity of the team that we're building. The average age of my communication team is like 26. And that's why we have reels and things in 7 different languages and reaching people where they are. It's why I do have a long list of people who can, and you can put your name on it, of people of young women of color who can speak on panels in these different committees and things that I serve on now. So because it can't always be me, and it shouldn't always be me. And so what responsibility, I think it's actually an obligation, a privilege to be able to introduce audiences and panels to that next generation. And so thank you for the opportunity to say that.
I'm going to accept the label of, I've got a great hair in my head, so I think I absolutely qualify. So what we've been doing at the National Minority Quality Forum, we launched a program, and Brendan Garrett, who's my chief of staff, actually started this program. It's called 40 Under 40, and we recognize 40 individuals every year who are under the age of 40. I think we have about 280 of them now. If you go to our website, you'll see they're fabulous. We do a summit, and I look at them and I see the future in their eyes. I am so excited for them. So we try at the National Minority Quality Forum to give them the opportunity to work with each other, to collaborate with us, because you're absolutely correct that we fail in the mission if we have not built for that future. So it is built into our DNAs to do that. Sure.
You have the last word,
Yes.
literally.
And I have to add, even though you call us old, hopefully that means wise.
She did. That was me. That was me. But to see how messaging works.
Yes. I'm taking the opportunity to equate it to wiseness. Then, no. So, but I think you asked actually a very important one, which is, I feel strongly on human capital. If we have the strongest, the best resource that we have actually is in our people. So at Pfizer, our first bold move is unleash the power of people. I really love that. It really resonates with me, is that I think the other issue is also, how do we recruit? How do we develop that talent? But also, how do we fix the leaky pipeline? Because we are also losing people, right, before they even. So I think this is important. This is actually a focus also at Pfizer, where we have our people experience. We have many programs going from STEM, we actually keep very close track, because unless you really can track it, you also don't know whether you are making a difference at the end of the day. So very important, and I think that is actually, I do feel human capital, diversifying that really is important and key to no matter what we do.
Well, I think that you all have heard a great diversity perspective on important issues and have seen also how there are lots of concrete and practical actions that can be taken when it comes to health equity inclusive research. So please join me in thanking Aida, Donna, and Gary for this discussion.
Thank you, Lina.